Vampire in Egypt, Volume 1, The Book of Life and Death, by Jodie Jiles. Chapter 1.
The birth of the Coven of Marius. The first known leader of the first united underground vampire coven was Marius. From birth, Marius's natural abilities as a warrior arose him to become the alpha of his family pack before he had reached his prime age. As alpha, Marius used his pre-gifted intellect and wisdom, which far exceeded any of the other vampires, and nurtured it. Marius's dedicated work on his mind, body and spirit set him apart as an alpha, and when his warrior pack followed the lifestyle example set by Marius, the pack quickly became a force to be reckoned with. After the cave dust of a battle cleared, Marius would assemble all of the survivors together. Some of the defeated vampires decided it was best to kill themselves rather than live with the shame of defeat, while others sought exile and fled. But the ones who survived and could not run were at loss, and they congregated unknowing of one another's fates. Yet instead of annihilating the packs, as one common custom, Marius spared the vampires that he could with an open invitation join the pack. Marius was a great leader for a species that united many lost, wandering vampires in the underground caves. Before Marius, vampires mentally developed at about the same rate as humans, slowly and through the process of trial and error. But as the numbers grew in Marius's pack, Marius decided it was best to assign varying roles for his pack to ensure greater good for the whole pack. Therefore, Marius assigned hunters to hunt for food and bring livestock back to the pack, while gatherers collected tools and other necessities. It was not until the night Marius fought Tella, a powerful and violent neighboring pack adversary, the first coven of Marius was officially formed. Unlike Marius, Tella killed all of his enemies with the common exception of selecting a few female vampires that he would rape and force to be one of his wives and produce his offspring for the herd. Tella's pack far exceeded Marius's pack in number by a ratio of 100:1. On the night of the clash between Marius and Tella, there was a battle initiated when Marius and his hunters unintentionally found themselves in Tella's territory while in pursuit of a herd escaping dinosaurs. As Marius and his hunters neared the herd, Marius suddenly noticed where he was at. Marius grunted to his hunters that trailed behind him in pursuit of a herd escaping dinosaurs. The pack stopped in their tracks once Marius ceased his pursuit. Marius examined his surroundings and knew he had accidentally entered the hunting ground of his rival, Tella. Marius grunted for his hunters to turn back. The hunter pack followed their alpha back to their borders, but it was a little too late. A vampire scout in Tella's pack then hung upside down from above the cave roof, watched below as Marius and his pack pursued the carnivores into Tella's territory. The scout vampire then roared a signaling roar, and he glided away to warn the others that intruders were present. Marius alerted his pack to stop their return to the border. As Marius and his pack stood in silence for a brief moment, they suddenly felt the ground beneath them begin to rumble. Marius quickly signaled for his pack to assume the battle formation with his hand. Suddenly, a large pack of vampires sprinted out of the darkness toward Marius, drawing nearer from every direction. Marius's pack did what they did best, tearing apart and slaying the vampires that approached from every direction. However, midway through the carnage, Marius paused momentarily and looked around at the senseless killings of the vampires by their own kind. "Enough!" Marius grunted to signal his pack to cease fighting. Marius's pack immediately followed the orders of their alpha. Surprisingly, the vampires in Tella's pack also stopped fighting, somewhat shocked at the unfamiliar acts of war by their adversary. Marius then walked alone through Tella's pack to approach their alpha, who stood on a high rock deep within his defenses. On Marius's way, a group of vampires in the pack of Tella blocked his path and snarled and hissed at him and prepared to attack. But Tella quickly growled at his pack and alerted them to let Marius through. Tella displayed a brief smirk as Marius neared, believing Marius had become surrendered like so many of the alphas Tella had defeated in the battles in the past. But once Marius and Tella were face to face, Tella automatically knew this was no surrender. It may have been the way Marius stood tall looking down at Tella directly in the eyes with no fear. One of Tella's younger wives then stood behind him, whispered to another wife something that crafted hilarious giggles. Tellus looked back at his giggling wives that were obviously infatuated by the sexual warrior's presence Marius had with his sweaty rock-hard body. Tellus's insecurity grew in him as his breaths grew deeper when he refaced with his opponent. Yet Marius retained his ground and did not strike. Ha! Tella roared out as he struck Marius with an unexpected slapping scratch to the face. Marius fell to the knee after the blow. Marius's pack began to growl at Tella's sucker punch, ready to defend their alpha, but Marius raised his hand as he picked himself up and told his pack to stay where they were. Once Marius attempted to get up, Tella punched him back to the cave ground with a double-fisted blow to the spine. While Marius was down, Tella then proceeded to kick Marius over and over again to a point where Marius was spitting up his own blood. Tella then turned to his pack and roared a roar full of pride as if to say the battle of the Alpha was won. Some of Marius's pack looked to each other in confusion, knowing that their Alpha was a better warrior than what was being displayed, while others looked in shame, refusing to see the defeat of their greatly respected leader. After hours of Marius taking a beating from Tella, Tella then roared at Marius as to tell Marius to fight him, but Marius did not retaliate and continued to take his beating while repeatedly signaling his pack not to advance. Once Tella picked up Marius's bruised and beaten body from the ground, he threw a knockout uppercut that made Marius's blood splat onto the face of Tella's wives in the audience. Tella's wives suddenly became drawn off by the brutality that were faced to witness as they wiped Marius's blood off their face. The youngest wife of Tella, however, was the only one turned on by the fight. She simply licked the blood of Marius off the side of her mouth. She sounded under the breath as Marius's body dropped on the ground in front of her. Tella then bent himself over to take a breath as Marius laid unconscious for a moment. When Marius came from the knockout punch, he saw his window of opportunity with Tellus's weakened exhaustion. Marius knew Tella had grown weary from the fight as he anticipated. It is at this time that the tides of the brawl turned in Marius's favor. Marius suddenly sprang up in the air to the surprise of Tella. As Marius landed behind Tella, he quickly put down his dominant arm around Tella's throat, placing him in a chokehold in which Tella could not undo. The pack of Marius uproared as the Alpha took back the fight. As Tella attempted to signal his pack to aid him in this time of need, Tella's pack seized the advance when Marius clinched Tella's choke and held tighter, roaring on the Alpha's road to the approaching adversaries. You see, vampires will always follow the strongest vampire, no matter the circumstances, and at the time, this appeared to be Marius. Usually, Marius would kill Tella when granted the golden opportunity to sever off Tella's head with a tightened choke. However, Marius looked out at the pack of Tella and saw the sorrow in their eyes as the Alpha squirmed for his final moments of life. In that moment, Marius decided to spare Tella and released him from the chokehold. The vampires of both packs were shocked at this unseen act of mercy. Marius gingerly stood before both packs and signaled to the vampires that they will no longer kill one another when he pretended to step on the head of Tella and stop himself mid-stomp. Marius roared to his pack first that this was law. Marius then helped Tella back up to his feet once he came out of his unconsciousness. Marius held Tella's hand up with his, signifying the first union of the two vampire packs, which in turn formed the first underground vampire coven of its kind. Marius and Tella then collapsed where they stood, exhausted from the battle they had endured. Nefertiti, an incredibly attractive and desirable vampire wife of Tella, approached the leaders with a wet cloth as they laid weary from the duel. Her naked, voluptuous figure drew the attention of all the males she suppressed with the mesmerizing aura she possessed. Her eyes shined a green emerald color, unlike anything seen underground. But instead of aiding her pack leader Tella, Nefertiti used this moment as an opportunity to gain the affections of the new victor, Marius. While Marius lay down exhausted, he looked down and watched as a blurry, narrow-waisted, wide-whipped figure approached. Nefertiti kneeled down to tend to the wounds of Marius, and suddenly, the blurry figure of Nefertiti became clear to Marius. Marius was in awe by the feminine uniqueness that he had never seen in the warrior-built butch females of his pack. Nefertiti's beautiful green eyes locked with Marius and did a long, slow slide with each and every blink as she gently wiped down his wounds. Nefertiti grew somewhat aroused as she wiped the blood off Marius's toned abdomen. She imagined what it would feel like to mate with someone like Marius. She fantasized how she would use her tongue all over Marius's body instead of the cloth which she continuously rotated over his stomach while lost in her fantasy. Nefertiti then snapped out of a daydream when Marius gently tapped his hand on hers as to say, "I think you cleaned my abs." As Marius attempted to say something, Nefertiti quickly put a soft finger over Marius's mouth, voicing the sound, "Shh." Marius obeyed the direction of Nefertiti and laid his back down. Nefertiti revealed a slight grin before she looked up at Tella, who had stared at Nefertiti the whole time she was tending to Marius. Nefertiti quickly removed the smirk from her face. Later that night, Marius was completely healed of his injuries after feeding on one of the carnivores his pack had trekked into Tella's territory. Immediately after Marius's wounds had healed, he summoned the leader of both packs to the coven of Tella. There, Marius used his motions to reiterate his wishes that the newly formed coven create a patch that was against the killing of another of their kind. Huh? Marius granted to reiterate the new law against the killing of vampires to their pack leaders. The pack leaders shook their heads in agreement. Huh, Marius exclaimed, insisting that all packs encountered from the point forward invited to unite as one. The pack leaders again shook their heads in agreement to Marius' proposal plans. Nefertiti, who listened out of sight, entered the rocky cavern entrance while Marius finished up his discussion with the pack leaders. Upon the sigh of Nefertiti, Marius momentarily became lost for words. "There she is again," Marius thought to himself. Marius then regained focus and instructed his pack to leave them with a grunt. The pack followed the commands of their alpha and exited the cavern. As Marius circled Nefertiti, the dormant sexuality of her body had been awakened, and a trembling thrill suddenly rushed through her body upon his touch down the arc of her spine. At first, Nefertiti drew back out of instinct. Prior to Marius, the only male touch she had felt prior to that was from the abusive former alpha and husband, Tella, who had raped her repeatedly since her family pack was slaughtered. Marius followed suit and drew back himself, unsure if his advances were permitted or not. But once Nefertiti realized he was with Marius and not Tella, she moved back in towards her new and improved Alpha. Nefertiti touched the side of Marius's face ever so gently before feeling up the flaccid muscles of his biceps and abdomen, which she had secretly craved to feel once more ever since the battle with Tella. Her eyes admired every piece of his flawless physique that could be grasped. As Nefertiti looked up at Marius's handsome face, Marius slowly kissed Nefertiti on her lips before moving down to her neck and collarbone. Once Marius had nearly come to a climax, he let out a mighty roar that could be heard throughout the entire coven. Marius then collapsed onto the floor beside Nefertiti. Nefertiti looked over at Marius as he slapped off the sex they had and grinned with the satisfaction that she had pleased her alpha lover to sleep. Nefertiti then wrapped her leg over her lover and traced her fingertips onto the rock-hard ridges of Marius's chest and abs so she adored. As the two laid into each other's arms on the sandy coven floor, they knew this night consumed the merger of two packs and marked the beginning of the new era for their species. The first child of Marius and Nefertiti was named Maxi. As a child, Maxi developed a rare disease that deformed and stunted the child's growth and development. Marius shunned the child for his deformities when he witnessed a few other younger vampires bullying Maxi. Marius watched in anticipation of the moment his son would fight back, but his son chose to retreat into the arms of Nefertiti. This one will never be an alpha, Marius thought to himself with a bitter taste of shame in his mind. Marius turned away from his son and Nefertiti. He thereafter sought other mates in the coven that could produce better suited offspring heirs. This act of betrayal developed a dark side in the core of Nefertiti's heart. While in isolation with her dying child, a dark spirit came to Nefertiti in her dreams. In the dream, a dark shadow figure escorted Nefertiti far outside of the coven's territory with Maxi in her arms. As Nefertiti approached the dead end, the shadowy figure recited an incantation that opened and green light during the cave wall. Once Nefertiti entered the door, the dark shadowy figure without face attempted to place his hand over the child to cast a spell, but Nefertiti quickly pulled Maxi away from the unknown figure at first, unsure of what was being done to her child. Then sudden jerk made Maxi crying in pain and agony. Seeing Maxi's weak condition, Nefertiti turned Maxi back towards the dark figure to cast his spell. The dark shadowed figure released a black smoke that entered the body while the spell was cast. Maxi immediately stopped crying as the last of the black smoke went inside the baby. Maxi then began to let out a childish laugh of happiness as the dark figure walked away. Nefertiti smiled, looking at her healed child as they exited. When Nefertiti awoke, she started seeking out vampires that had the healing power she saw in her dream. After Nefertiti continuously searched for her savior, she came across the old decrepit vampire named Luam, who had come from one of the other smaller packs that peacefully merged with the coven. Luam originally came from a rumored secret cult of disciples who followed a mighty sorcerer known by the name of Imhotep. Nefertiti walked with her sleeping child over the shoulder to the land where Imhotep's follower resided. When Nefertiti arrived to the borders, Luam slowly approached Nefertiti with a few of Imhotep's followers trailing behind. Imhotep? Nefertiti requested while she presented Maxi to Luam. Luam examined the child that was fast asleep over his mother's shoulder. Luam raised Maxi's hand and tried to prick his finger, which caused Nefertiti to become defensive mother. Nefertiti therefore extended her fangs and hissed at Luam. For Imhotep, Luam then grunted to Nefertiti. Nefertiti began to have second thoughts about this situation as she looked into Maxi's eyes as they slowly awoke from the slumber. Nefertiti then raised Maxi from his resting place, pricked the baby's finger, and dropped 3 droplets of blood into the hand of Luam. Luam picked up a small rock on the floor, placed the blood on her hand onto the rock, and walked away. The next night, Nefertiti went to Marius, who was preoccupied with one of his newest concubines, Kata, the youngest former wife of Tela. Unlike Nefertiti, who had been raped repeatedly by Tela, he never touched Keta, since her body was not of age to bear children. However, now, Keta had become of age. After Marius' climax inside Keter, Nefertiti entered and told Marius of the healer Imhotep. She requested that Marius send hunters to follow Luam to ensure Imhotep is brought back to the coven safely to heal their son. Marius agreed simply to get Nefertiti off his back and sent 2 of his hunters to track Luam on her journey to bring Imhotep to the coven. While Luam and the hunters searched for Imhotep, Marius continued to try to produce a son worthy of his seat as Alpha. But once it was discovered that the child Ketabo was a female vampire, Marius was again displeased and looked to another vampire to bear him a male heir. To relieve the stress of his inabilities to produce a son, Marius did what relieved him best in the past days, a hunt in the underground cave. While in the enchanted regions of the underground caves, Marius suddenly heard a squint baby vampire roar from a distance. Marius followed the direction of the sound and discovered a baby vampire sitting at the top of a cavern roaring down at the pack of the velociraptors trying to reach the child. When Marius approached the pack of the velociraptors, they turned their attention to Marius when alerted. 2 of the raptors immediately lunged at Marius. Marius ducked away from the first raptor and grabbed the second by his leg after he passed, smashing his head to the ground like a hammer to the nail. Once the second raptor picked itself up, it made a call for other raptors to come help. Marius lunged toward the raptor and landed on the raptor and feed on its neck to point of the raptor's jerking death. After Marius finished feeding on the raptor, Marius approached the child and noticed 2 half-eaten vampire corpses laid on the ground. It was clear to Marius that these were the parents of the baby vampire. When Marius climbed to the cave rocks and reached his hand to remove the baby vampire from the rock base above, the baby vampire roared and swiped his extended small claw nail at Marius, cutting Marius' hand in the process. Marius quickly removed his hand back and snarled back at the baby vampire. The baby vampire roared at Marius again to challenge him. Gia, a warrior queen and Marius' sister, climbed up gracefully and placed her hand on Marius' shoulder as to say, "Allow me to try." Gia tore off a limb of one of the velociraptors laying on the ground, approached the baby vampire, and fed the baby vampire with the velociraptor's blood. The baby accepted the offering and fed on the limb like a pacifier. Gia then consoled the baby and held him close to her bosom. As Gia carried the baby vampire away from her, Marius looked at the baby vampire as it growled at Marius one last time before he blacked and fell asleep. Marius found himself amused by the fight in the baby vampire and even caught himself smiling momentarily as the baby vampire was carried away. Once Marius returned to the coven, the food collected from the hunt was distributed to the vampires in the coven. Nefertiti welcomed Marius with her son Max in hand while the food was distributed to the coven at the entrance. Marius walked past Nefertiti without even looking at his child. Nefertiti then noticed Marius was trailed by Gia holding a strong baby boy in hand. Gia handed the baby to Marius, while Gia took a little girl, Maya, that stayed behind during the hunt. Marius raised the boy in his hand, and the 2 stared at each other with a look of confusion as Gia reunited with her daughter. Nefertiti quickly grabbed the arm of one of the hunters, looked in the direction of Marius, and grunted to ask who is this child Marius carried. The hunter replied with a shrug of his shoulders as to say, "I don't know." On the nights that followed, Marius grew fond of the new baby vampire and named him Darius. Marius proudly raised Darius as if he were one of his own. As Darius grew into his adolescence, Marius admired the fighting spirit and strength that Darius had. It reminded Marius of himself, the way the child rose up to the warrior ranks of his coven so quickly. After another decade had passed, Imhotep finally arrived to the coven with a small group of his disciples that now included Marius' 2 hunters. Nefertiti greeted Imhotep to Marius, who was first drawn back by his hideous, strangely faded appearance and terrifying look of pure evil in his eyes. Nefertiti then called for a limping son Maxi to Imhotep so that he could perform his mysterious powers of healing. Imhotep pulled out a manuscript from what appeared to be a skin of his hip and quickly began to recite an incantation. He then dropped a few trinkets of his blood into the mouth of Maxi, which made Maxi scream as he fell to the ground. But within a matter of seconds, the vampire's weakness Max's bones strengthened and healed within the child's body. Nefertiti bowed and praised Imhotep for saving her son. Nefertiti ran to Marius, who stood near watching Imhotep perform a healing over his son. She moaned and whimpered for Marius to allow Imhotep to stay with the coven as a healing sorcerer for the coven. Marius granted for Maxi to come to him. When Maxi arrived, Marius examined his son by punching him in the chest and arms. After seeing the healing powers of Imhotep, Marius thought of Imhotep as an invaluable asset in the days that followed. Marius walked over to Imhotep and immediately drawn back to the smell of the unsavory death that reeked of Imhotep. "You speak?" Marius grunted to Imhotep. "Yes," Imhotep grunted back. "What did you do to my son?" Marius grunted. "He is strong and will live long," Imhotep replied. "Thank you," Marius concluded before he welcomed Imhotep into his coven. Marius authorized Imhotep to place a practice in healing magic with his disciples on the outskirts of the coven's lands. Marius later decided that once Maxi reached an age of understanding, he would join Imhotep to learn Imhotep's way of healing as his apprentice. Nefertiti looked to Marius as to say the child should learn from the Alpha now that he's healed, but Marius still saw the silky vampire and Maxi despite Imhotep's healing magic. So, Marius refused to change his mind with a growl to Nefertiti as to say, "Do not question me again." Nefertiti conceded the final decision of her Alpha and allowed Maxi to go with Imhotep. In the decades that followed, Marius attempted to bear a son one last time with Sia, the youngest daughter of another merging Alpha's pack. However, this time Sia had a miscarriage and Marius decided he was done trying to bear a son again. Instead, Marius passed on many of his skills as a vampire hunter and leader to Darius, his adopted son. Throughout the remainder of Marius' reign, he played a significant part in the creation of the new vampireness language and the universal writing system of drawing pictures on rocks and all vampires in mighty coven. In Marius' mind, education was a vehicle for growth and progress of his people, and there was no one better to oversee that progress other than himself. That doesn't mean he was a tyrant who kept all powers to himself. Instead, Marius gave powers to those he trusted. He created a council wherein powers were divided based on each vampire's specific powers. Darius, who grew to be the wisest and strongest of the coven, was assigned the role of Marius' right hand. Darius' slender and muscular physique was unmatched only to Marius in the coven. His warrior skills and physical presence alone crafted fear in the enemies he confronted and lust in the females he would come across. He was Marius with a 100,000-year head start. The only physical rival in the coven that seemed fit to challenge Darius for the position of Marius' right hand was Kimbo. Kimbo, a bulky, framed vampire servant under Marius, is one of his most skilled hunters. Kimbo was as strong, if not stronger than Darius. However, on the night Marius chose his right hand, Darius' intelligence far exceeded Kimbo. Seeing both Darius and Kimbo were physically qualified to serve as the right hand of the Alpha, Marius held a battle royale tournament to decide which of the two should be his right hand. In this tournament, Kimbo and Darius would first face any vampires that challenged, then the two would duel each other if defeated or contenders. As expected, Kimbo and Darius defeated each of the few contending vampires with little to no effort. Marius staged the final battle between Darius and Kimbo for the entire coven to watch and learn from their fighting techniques against one another. In their final duel, Kimbo continuously chased and tackled Darius for what seemed to be an entire night, while Darius continually maneuvered himself to avoid the attack after attack by his opponent. "Fight me, you fool!" Kimbo ranted and ranted. "You have to hit me first," Darius joked for the Coven's entertainment. The Coven got a good laugh out of this whole debacle, which irritated Kimbo even more. As the countless hours of Kimbo attacks passed, Kimbo's strikes became slower and weaker, likened to what Marius expected in his duel against Tella. Marius quickly removed the edge of his seat, reminded of the same moment observed the night he fought with Tella. Once Kimbo threw one last punch that finally burnt him out, he suddenly fell to his knees, completely exhausted. "Now!" Marius said to himself. At this exact moment, Darius attacked the tired and defenseless Kimbo. But just when Darius was about to finish off Kimbo with his final blow, Kimbo could not look at him in the eyes, so he stopped mid-attack. "Enough!" Kimbo pleaded. "Do you concede?" Darius asked Kimbo. Kimbo shook bloodied and beaten head. "I concede," Kimbo declared out of breath. Darius dropped Kimbo's body to the floor where he laid unconscious after defeat. Marius arose from his seat and applauded the victor. The Coven vampires cheered for Darius, followed by others who awoke. "And so it is settled. Darius shall be my right hand from this time till my end or his," Marius announced to the Coven. Darius looked over to Kimbo, who was still laid down on the ground, to catch his breath. "May I ask a request, my Alpha?" Darius then proclaimed. "Anything," Marius responded. "I ask that Kimbo be named my leader of the vampire hunter packs," Darius requested. "But that is a position for you as the right hand," Marius replied. "I know, but Kimbo deserves a chance to prove himself as a leader and not just as a follower. This will present him with such a chance. I hope he doesn't think he's unworthy because he is worthy. He just needs more of the skills and strategies you taught me," Darius explained. Marius took a second to think about his decision. Marius looked over to Kimbo, who had picked himself up by now. "Do you accept this defeat and your right hand's decision for you?" Marius asked Kimbo. Kimbo looked over to his friend Darius's counsel to ensure and accept life or decline and kill himself from the shame of defeat as a hunter. "Do it. You always wanted this since you were little ones," Darius told his friend under his breath. "I will do my duty," Kimbo replied to Marius. "Agreed," Marius stated. "Kimbo shall be the new leader of the vampire hunters," Marius concluded before he took his seat. Darius then walked over to Kimbo. "Congratulations, leader of the pack," Darius told Kimbo as he smiled and hugged his best friend. "You didn't have to do that for me. It was your prize, not mine," Kimbo said after their embrace. "I knew it was you that always spoke of leading the hunting packs since we were children. Now you have the chance," Darius replied. Darius could see Kimbo still feel like he didn't deserve the honor. "How about this? Prove to me I made the right decision, and if you mess it up, I will replace you," Darius told Kimbo. Kimbo gave the offer some thought for a moment, then smiled at his friend. "Thank you, Darius. You have no idea how much this means to me," Kimbo said before he bear-hugged Darius and threw him against the cave wall. "Don't mention it," Darius responded, nearly out of breath from Kimbo's strong embrace. Thereafter, Gia and Nefertiti were appointed as Marius's voice to the people of the Coven, tending to the youth as well. Kata, Marius's new youngest wife, served as Gia and Nefertiti's assistant and understudy. Imhotep remained the chief sorcerer and chief of medicine. He was tasked to continue to organize his manuscript, now called the Book of Life and Death, by his followers. His protege Maxi, son of Marius and Nefertiti, would serve as Imhotep's understudy. Originally, the purpose of the Book of Life and Death was to be used for good healing magic alone. However, Imhotep believed that the only way to truly understand the force of good was to understand the force of evil. He saw them as two sides of the same coin, and maybe he was right, but Imhotep continued to practice the dark art. The evil quickly spread through him. You see, evil does not give without taking something greater in return. Imhotep secretly studied these practices and added scroll sheets documenting the evil knowledge he had gained into the Book of Life and Death, unknown best to other coven. These dark practices of Imhotep and his understudy Maxi are what led to the first apocalypse of the earth during the prehistoric times of the dinosaurs. Chapter 2: The Beginning of the End. Throughout the next 2 centuries, Marius extended his underground vampire coven, yet with aging had grown weary of the combat role he had been tasked. Therefore, Darius and Kimber helped their leader appear strong to the coven, despite him occasionally showing signs of weakness that could cause strife among the people. The strategy worked to perfection, and if any suspected Marius' inabilities, that is until Marius faced an unfamiliar foe who he had never come across with. The death of Marius. One night on a hunt in underground dinosaur lands, Marius was surprised by an underground T-Rex that was hidden behind a large rock while feeding on smaller dinosaurs. Usually, Marius was too alert and too aware of his surroundings to get surprised by anything so large, but this T-Rex was different from the other dinosaurs of the underground in that the creature appeared to show no sign of being alive. Marius didn't know what to make of it. A creature that looked and smelt dead. It even felt safe the way Marius' heat-sensing ability skipped over the area, seeing no signs of life. What was this bloodthirsty monster? When the T-Rex sped into Marius with a speed he had never seen in a predator, the T-Rex mortality wounded him. Marius was a prolific fighter who had endured many wounds and had many scars, but he knew something was different about this wound. The bite was deep and cut past his ribs, making him lose blood faster than his body could replace it. When Marius attempted to rise on his feet, his breath grew short once he realized one of his ribs had punctured a lung. As the T-Rex approached Marius, the ground trembled with every step it took. Marius took a second to appreciate the irony of him, a creature of stealth and darkness being killed by an animal that rampaged rather than strategized, defeating all of the principles of logic that he founded his entire life on. Darius suddenly appeared after he too had felt the rumbling approach of attacking T-Rex. Darius roared viciously as he jumped in front of the T-Rex, drawing the T-Rex away from Marius. Darius knew that Marius would not last long against the T-Rex in place that had no caves to hide in, so he used his mutant power of communication with the beast to put the T-Rex under the power of a trance. As powerful as his gift of trance was, it was prematurely limited as it could only last a huge animal like that a few minutes. It was a good thing that he only needed a moment to extend one of his razor-sharp claws that he had now become more like a dagger and cut into the T-Rex's head off with a clean wipe of his hand. Marius was relieved that he had survived the T-Rex's attack. "My Alpha, are you alright?" Darius asked while he helped Marius to his feet. "I am now," Marius replied. Marius then looked to the mortal wound crafted by the T-Rex's bite and spit on his hand, placing the spit over his wound in an attempt to heal the wound. Unfortunately, the wound will not heal. Darius was worried about what he had just witnessed. "Do you need to feed?" Darius then said. "That will help," Darius concluded. Marius walked with a limp over to the T-Rex and fed on its blood until he was nearly full. His belly grew large with blood, but before he finished his meal, he noticed that his wounds still had not healed. Marius attempted to conceal his mortal wounds that remained and walked tall as he led his pack back to their homelands. Since Marius was used to ignoring his own pain and showing no sign of weakness, he successfully healed his injuries. No one noticed his injuries remained. While the vampires walked through the underground, Marius's mortal wounds continued to worsen as blood continued to gush out. An unknown fact to Marius and Darius at the time was that the T-Rex that bit into Marius was a result of a dark spell of Imhotep. Marius had no idea that the dinosaur was a ghoul, that ghoul blood only slows down the healing process for vampire. All Marius knew was that his wound was not healing. One of the vampire hunters began to catch on after he sniffed the air. "Do any of you smell the blood?" the hunter called out to the others. "Move along," Darius instructed despite also smelling the same thing himself. The vampire hunters continued their march home. Once Marius and the other vampire hunters returned to their homelands with the spoils of their hunt, the hungry vampires into the coven sprinted to feed on the various captured beasts as they brought in. While feeding, one of the younger male vampires noticed their leader Marius' injury when Marius nearly fell to the ground but was quickly caught and picked up by Darius. The younger male vampire immediately stopped feeding, rose up and snarled, challenging their wounded leader. It was a cruel world in the vampire coven. Any sign of weakness could be exploited by anyone, even younger vampires. Marius looked to Darius as Darius extended his claws to protect Marius. Seeing the peril of the situation, Marius grabbed Darius's hand and turned one of Darius's claws toward his own neck. "Kill me," Marius told Darius. Darius shook his head while he removed his blade from Marius's neck. "I cannot," Darius replied. Marius turned the blade back towards himself and snarling vampires approached. "You must, my son. I want you to take my place and not," Marius stated as he looked off the forthcoming vampires over Darius' shoulders. "You must kill me in front of everyone now. You have very little time. Vampires always follow the strongest vampire. Kill me now before it's too late," Marius frantically concluded. Darius took a long breath and cut Marius' head off right before the single-minded vampires arrived. Darius then turned to the vampires that approached and killed each one of them in front of the coven. Once the mutinous vampires were all slain, Darius fell to his knees as the vampires in the coven surrounded him. Darius held the body of Marius as it decayed into ashes. Then and there, the coven embraced Darius as the new Alpha and was soon after crowned the new leader of the vampires' underground coven. All vampires remember the reign of Marius fondly, even the ones who weren't alive when he ruled. It was a golden time for them, filled with stories they still tell each other to this day. Vampires also remember the reign that came after his, for the things they survived and the ones they lost on the journey. This is their story. During the crowning ceremony, Darius was given all of the mothers of Marius' children as tribute. Nefertiti was the first mother presented to Darius. Darius bowed down to his new queen. Nefertiti tried her best to hold a smile, but once she was in the clear, frowned of disappointment that Maxi, Marius' first son, was not the successor. Gia followed Nefertiti as the sister of Marius. At first, Gia attempted to maintain a formality of the moment when approached, despite still seeing the little baby vampire she rescued from the voluptuous so many years ago. When Gia bowed, Darius shook his head in disagreement once she arose. "You can do better than that, mother," Darius said while he extended his arms. Gia smiled at Darius with open arms, giving him a huge motherly hug. "There it is," Darius said as the two embraced. "Ha ha!" Keta caught next in line to greet Darius. Gia then remembered her place, released her embrace and continued on with the ceremony. As Keta approached Darius with her daughter of Marius, she gave Darius a look that said she was willing and ready to get started making babies with him anytime, anywhere. After the reminder of the wives Marius presented to Darius, he addressed the coven with a roar calling attention. "I have chosen my council," Darius announced with authority. He didn't even waste any time in choosing. Keta leaned over to Nefertiti and jokingly said, "Shh." Nefertiti sounded while she keenly listened to Darius's announcement over the new council. "Kimbo shall be moved up to my right-hand position," Darius began. "I am truly honored," Kimbo stated while pounded his fist to his chest. Darius nodded to his close friend. "The great alpha of our past, Tella, shall serve as the leader of our vampire hunters," Darius then stated. "As you wish, my alpha," Tella said as he pounded his fist to his chest. "The only mother I have ever known, Gia, shall be my voice to the people, and Nefertiti shall help her transition to the position as her apprentice," Darius continued. Gia smiled at her adopted son and shook her head in acceptance of the promoted position. She then looked over to Nefertiti and walked over excited with her. "We will do so much good work with the coven together," Gia told Nefertiti. Nefertiti looked back at Gia with a sarcastic smile. "Great," Nefertiti replied. When Nefertiti turned away from Gia, she whispered to Keta, "How did Marius put it? Please kill me." Keta childishly giggled at the insensitive comment. "Imhotep shall remain charlatan with Maxi as his understudy," Darius announced. Imhotep looked at Darius for a moment without emotions, then returned to his stomping ground with Maxi trailing behind. "This is the new council of the coven. Give them the same respect you will give me. Anything said against them is also said against me. My word is bond," Darius declared. "Now that the formalities are done, let the celebrations begin," Darius concluded. Once the formal ceremonies were over, a tribal festival began that celebrated the start of the new regime of Darius. As the vampires sang and danced, suddenly a quake rocked the rocks above them, and large pieces of rocks fell down from the roof of the caves. The coven screamed and scattered as the cave rocks fell down to them. After the dust had cleared, all of the vampires and the celebrated paused in their tracks as Darius approached the giant pile of rocks that nearly fell on his coven. In that moment, Darius bended down on one knee and then looked up the hole created in the roof. "It is time for us to prepare," Darius stated to the coven. No one but Keta had the nerve to approach Darius. "Prepare for what, my alpha?" Keta asked. Instead of answering a question, Darius ignored her, lost in the distant memory where he and Marius had rested after a hunt. "This cannot be all there is," Marius said as he tended to the wounds he had received on a hunt. "Father, what do you mean?" Darius replied in a calm state, confused by the question posed. Marius responded clearly to his adopted son would know that he was serious. "There is something above us. We've all felt the tremors that came and go. They sound like something is up there. Does it not? Possibly a whole new world, maybe even better than ours. We shall go there one day," Marius said. "Now we will," Darius whispered to himself, feeling the weight of the memory. Then and there, Darius stood upright like a tall shadow over the rest of the coven. He pointed to the cave roof and proclaimed, "We will prepare to rise up. We will rise up. We will rise up." A chant picked up quickly, and soon the whole coven chanted words, "We will rise." The coven cheered as Darius walked back to plan the vampire's rise to the surface of the world. Chapter 3. One step forward, one step back. On the night that followed, Darius called his council to plan the coven's rise to the surface. The councilors looked to one another, unsure of the proper response. So Darius drew out a carving on the rock wall for all to see. After Darius finished a simple sketch of two surface lines signifying the surface world and the underground world, he spoke. "Now we're here," Darius started while he pointed to the bottom line drawn. "And we need to get there." Darius continued while he rose his finger to the top line drawn. "I need each of you to think of the best ways we can rise to the world above," Darius instructed his council. "We shall reconvene once you all have given our rise some thought," Darius concluded. The council dispersed once Darius finished his remarks and turned away. Darius walked over to his sketch on the cave wall and started to doubt if the rise to the surface was such a good idea. As Gia exited the council room, she looked back at Darius in his distressed state and retraced her step back into the council room to tend to her child. "What troubles you?" Gia said as she approached. Darius quickly hid the look of concern on his face with a pleasant smile and replied, "I'm fine, just a little tired." "You never were a good liar," Gia said while she gently brushed a motherly hand on the side of Darius's face as once she did to Darius as a boy. "You need to rest. Even an alpha needs rest," Gia told Darius as the two locked eyes. "I will," Darius answered gingerly. "You will be a great alpha of our coven. Stop worrying so much. We are all behind you," Gia said as she patted Darius on his back. Gia then exited and left Darius in the council chambers. As Darius kept the reasons for his concern to himself, his doubts made him less vigilant in the days that followed. If not, he would have noticed something different about his lead sorcerer Imhotep. Unbeknownst to the others in the coven, Imhotep had experimented with a spell in the Book of Life and Death that allowed him to control various dinosaurs he possessed under his dark magic. Imhotep was motivated to create his magic when he witnessed Darius put a trance on a smaller dinosaur as a child. In the early experimental phases of the spell, Imhotep could only control the smaller dinosaurs and did not have full control of the larger beast. Imhotep learned this valuable lesson earlier when one of the T-Rexes under his spell escaped into the underground. The dark spell that Imhotep cast over his T-Rex lost its mind and bodily control of the large beast while Imhotep was asleep. Coincidentally, this T-Rex just happened to be the same T-Rex that attacked Marius. Hence, Imhotep was unable to identify the undead beast with his heat-sensing powers and could not heal once his stomach was full with the blood of the undead T-Rex. Once it was discovered by Imhotep, this missing T-Rex may be the cause of Marius' unforeseen death, Imhotep ceased all trials with the dark spell. But when Imhotep was tasked with finding a way for the coven to ascend, Imhotep decided to resurrect his dark spell in the Book of Life and Death. He chose to use his dark magic to compel his ghoulish dinosaurs to do the work for the vampires on their ascension to the surface world. Only first, Imhotep needed to figure out how to maintain full control of the larger dinosaurs in order to accomplish the coven's goals. The cost of doing such dark and powerful spell would first require blood from the sorcerer. With the smaller dinosaurs, just a drop of blood was required. However, for the larger beast, Imhotep decided much more blood would be necessary this time around. After Imhotep continuously used excessive amounts of his blood on his spell to control his herd of large dinosaurs, Imhotep quickly discovered the unknown side effects that followed. The dark magic that fueled the spell fed on Imhotep's mind, body and soul like a parasite. As a result of the spell, Imhotep's body became frail and weak, which gave him the appearance of an elder 10 times his age. The dark magic also infected Imhotep's mind and placed an endless collection of evil thoughts and voices he had never heard before. The dark magic also left a significant mark on Imhotep's soul. The good that was in Imhotep's heart to use his magic for healing was replaced and overcome by a dark spirit that sought power through the use of evil practices. Early on, Maxie was the only one who suspected anything odd about Imhotep, while the others in the coven were preoccupied with their hopes and despairs about their ascension to the surface world. For this reason, Maxie decided to keep his suspicions to himself. After a few nights that had followed, Imhotep came to Darius in his council chambers. "Why haven't we figured this out yet?" Darius asked himself before he noticed Imhotep's presence. When Imhotep's presence was known, Darius turned to his sorcerer. "Do you have something for me?" Darius asked. "I have the answer you have been looking for, my Alpha," Imhotep replied. "Come," Imhotep stated as he directed Darius into a separate chamber room. When Darius saw what Imhotep had planned, he was pleased and smiled back at Imhotep. Darius then called his council to the coven and said the solution Imhotep proposed. At the council gathering, Imhotep revealed his dark magic spell and its effects on the large possessed dinosaurs. The council was amazed in wonder by the large beast, who followed every command of Imhotep. "He has more control over them than you do," Kimber joked to Darius. As Maxie watched his magical presentation, he grew more concerned than amazed, because he had never seen the spell performed in all of his years as Imhotep's apprentice. After the council meeting ended, Darius and the others congratulated Imhotep on his proposal. Maxie walked over to Imhotep and requested a moment alone. "May I ask to speak with you for a moment?" Maxie asked. Imhotep nodded in agreement and walked over to the side of the rocky council room with Maxie. "What is it?" "You see, my people are calling me," Imhotep said as he looked back in the direction of the cheerful garrison council. "Your people? If you don't mind me asking, my master, what has gotten into you? You're not the same vampire as before," Maxie stated. Imhotep snapped out of it before he looked back to his apprentice. "I am the same vampire. What are you talking about, my apprentice?" Imhotep answered. "What is this magic you just did? I haven't seen it before." "I'm afraid it changed you, master," Maxie said. "Silence, you fool!" Imhotep suddenly replied with an unfamiliar darkness spirit voice. Imhotep turned away from Maxie and proceeded to be congratulated by Darius and the Coven Council as Maxie hopelessly watched. Over the course of the century, Imhotep possessed hundreds of dinosaurs that created a tunnel path for the vampires to go back and forth from the underground to the surface world. Once the tunnel path was completed, Darius led the coven through the path with Imhotep at his side. The evil that developed in Imhotep suddenly called to him unbeknownst to the others. "Imhotep," the dark whispering voice called. Imhotep looked around in search of the mysterious voice that called his name. "Imhotep," the voice called again. "Did you hear something?" Imhotep asked Maxie. "No," Maxie replied. Imhotep looked around again and proceeded to walk up the tunnel with Darius. "With our religion of the possessed, we could kill them all," Imhotep's spirit said to him. Imhotep paused for a moment, then continued on and acted as if he did not hear the voice in his head. After days and nights of the evil spirit's speeches, Imhotep started to find himself somewhat seduced by the idea of power as the dark voice continued in his head. "We could do it right here, right now. Just give the beast the command. All will bow to you, and those who refuse will die. You shall rule them all." The dark spirit spoke. "Stop!" Imhotep yelled out loud before he snapped out of his trance. Darius raised his hand, and the coven stopped their march by the tunnel. All eyes were on Imhotep. "What is it now? Why have we stopped?" asked Darius.
"I apologize, my master. I thought I saw something in the distance,"
Imhotep replied with a confused look on his face. "It must be the air up here," Darius jokingly stated as he aggressively patted Imhotep on his shoulder. Darius then motioned his hand forward and commanded his coven, "Move along." The coven followed the orders of their alpha and continued up the tunnel path to the surface. When the coven finally approached the tunnel's peak, opening the surface world, Imhotep paused momentarily while Darius and the others continued to move forward. Imhotep thought to himself that the evil that had developed within him was too much for him to control in the night that followed. "We're almost there. I still can't believe we did it," Darius said as he looked over to his side where Imhotep was walking before. "Imhotep!" Darius exclaimed, then looked back and saw his sorcerer as he stood still as a rock a few paces behind. Darius walked back to his sorcerer to see what it was this time.
"This is where I leave you,"
Imhotep told Darius in a somber voice. "What are you talking about, my friend? I need you now more than ever," Darius protested as he got into Imhotep's face. Darius finally saw the torment and suffering Imhotep had endured when Darius looked into Imhotep's haunted eyes. "What happened to you?" Darius asked with a worried tone. Imhotep struggled for a moment as his eyes returned to their normal vampire state.
"I'm afraid I can no longer control the darkness,"
Imhotep struggled to say.
"I must stay,"
Imhotep concluded with an evil dark tone. Imhotep's haunted eyes returned. Darius felt remorse for Imhotep in his state. "Imhotep shall return to the world that is under, to watch over it for us as we live on the surface world," Darius proclaimed with his royal tone. Sounds of groans and moans arose from the coven. "This is my command," Darius then roared, and all were silent. Maxi ran over to Imhotep. "You're leaving us?" "I shall go with you," Maxi proclaimed. Imhotep struggled again for a moment as his eyes returned to their normal vampire state.
"You must go with the coven. Hurry and take us with you. Whatever you do, don't open it. Promise me,"
Imhotep instructed Maxi. Maxi nodded in agreement, and Imhotep hesitantly gave the Book of Life and Death to Maxi. With the Book of Life and Death in hand, Maxi gazed at the golden glow that glared over it. Imhotep's haunted eyes returned for a moment.
"Now go, you fool,"
Imhotep concluded with a dark and evil voice. Maxi backed away from Imhotep and returned with the coven. Imhotep then commanded the possessed dinosaurs to return with him to the underground. As Maxi continued his slow walk over the coven, Maxi grew concerned of what would come of Imhotep as he looked back at Imhotep's walk with his dinosaurs down the tunnel. "Take care of yourself, master," Maxi yelled down the tunnel. Imhotep paused, followed by the dinosaurs. After standing frozen for a moment, Imhotep continued down the tunnel with the dinosaurs. Maxi then continued with the coven and wondered how his life would be changed forever as the coven's lead sorcerer. Nefertiti first greeted Maxi with a hug as he rejoined the group with the Book of Life and Death in hand. "I always knew this day would come for you, my son," Nefertiti exclaimed with blood tears dripping down her face. Nefertiti momentarily reminisced as the embrace of a previous lover and Alpha Marius. The followers of Imhotep then gathered around Maxi once they saw he had the Book of Life and Death in his possession. Maxi looked around while Nefertiti continued to hold him, and he felt embarrassment that the others in the coven quietly made fun of the embrace. "Mama's boy," a coven vampire stated, followed by laughter. "Enough, mother," Maxi whispered in Nefertiti's ear. Nefertiti quickly gathered herself. "Oh, I apologize. I just know this is the only beginning to your true destiny that awaits." Nefertiti said as she rotated her eyes in the direction of Darius. When the vampires reached the tunnel entrance to the surface world, they immediately discovered their lathered allergy to sunlight. Two younger vampires that were near the front of the coven bickered. "First one to reach the surface gets my bloody snack," said one of the youths. The two youngsters then took off and raced to the entrance surface. "Wait!" Darius yelled. But the two youngsters were too focused on their race to the sunlit finish line to hear their alpha's call. The challenging vampire crossed the threshold of the cave entrance, while the vampire who trailed stayed behind in shaded cave to catch his breath. "I am the first! Praise Marius! I am the first!" the young vampire exclaimed as he danced in the sunlight. The other vampires in the coven smiled at the joy of the young vampire as they all began to follow. Just before the coven could break the threshold behind the lead of Darius, Darius raised his mighty hand to halt the coven. Darius noticed smoke that began to rise from the young vampire in the sunlight. The vampire's smile quickly turned into a painful scream as his skin began to bubble, exploding pus from his flesh. "What's happening to me?" the vampire screamed before he suddenly burst into flames. Darius looked down as some of the ashes that remained of the young vampire breezed across his feet at the cave entrance threshold. "We should not have come here!" exclaimed the vampire hidden in the crowd. "This is a sign that this is not a home!" yelled another vampire. Darius then roared a challenging alpha's roar to the entire coven, and all were silent. "Give me some time to figure this out with my new sorcerer," Darius pleaded. While Darius walked over to Maxie, he knew that with a setback as small as this could shake the entire coven's faith in him. "Based off your experience with the previous master, how do we address this?" Darius asked Maxie. "I've never seen anything like this before, my alpha," Maxie proclaimed. "Well, I hope you can figure it out, for both our sakes," Darius said before he gulped of worry. Maxie then walked over to the edge of the entrance where the light met the darkness shadow of the cave. Maxie stared at the dividing line for a moment. "We should have never let Imhotep leave us when we needed him the most," a voice yelled from the witnessing coven crowd. The others in the coven moaned and yelled in support of the remark made. "This one called Maxie is too young and not prepared for the task. We will surely die if we follow." Another voice hollered. "Is that a challenge?" roared Darius. The coven again grew silent. "If anyone would like to challenge my decision as alpha, speak up," Darius declared. Once the ruckus settled, Maxie continued to study the barrier of the coven's entrance. Maxie stuck his long fingernail into the sunlight across the threshold of the darkness. Maxie's fingernail immediately started to burn up before Maxie quickly pulled up his hand into the shade of the cave. "Ah!" Maxie yelled in anguish. A congregation of coven vampires that were talking nearby looked over when Maxie screamed. "This child knows nothing, you see. We are doomed," a vampire in the group said. Many of the coven vampires were assumed by the remark and laughter filled in the cave entrance. Maxie started to feel the pressure of his new position on him. Darius, who sat with his council nearby, turned back in the direction of Maxie after Nefertiti coughed to draw Darius's attention to her son Maxie. Darius walked over when he saw the coven's vampires making fun of Maxie. "Here comes Darius!" one of the prankest coven vampires exclaimed. The coven vampires immediately acted like they were having another conversation. "I love what you've done with your claws. Where did you claw them?" the prankster coven vampire said to the others as Darius passed. Darius approached Maxie from behind and heard Maxie repeating to himself, "What would Imhotep do?" as he contemplated the best solution for his problem at hand. "You know something? I would do the same thing with the Father Marius's name too when I need counsel on a hunt," Darius told Maxie as he approached. "You did?" Maxie asked. "All the time," Darius responded. He had a game where he would just leave me and lead the hunters by myself and test me and make me better. This is your chance to do the same thing here. Prove yourself. Make those who tease and laugh to be fools when it is all said and done, Darius told Maxie. Darius saw his words were not leaving the mark he sought. Listen, just let me know if you need anything and if anyone is bothering you again. And take all the time you need. I know you'll prevail us through this, my brother, Darius concluded before he returned with the others in the Vampire Council. Maxie continued to pace and contemplate his issue at the edge of the cave entrance. After a while, Maxie sat at a corner inside the cave to think. There, Maxie unintentionally dozed off into a slumber as he sat. Once the sun had completely set, Maxie awoke in shock, afraid that one of the others in the coven had seen him asleep in their time of dire need. But when Maxie peeked over the rock he was sleeping on, no one even noticed his presence. They were all focused on their breakfast and booty chatter, so Maxie got up and proceeded to the edge of the cave. However, the barrier line of light and dark changed and was replaced with the barrier of moonlight darkness outside and darker shade of night inside. Where did the light go? Maxie thought to himself. Maxie decided to stick his finger outside of the cave once again and grimaced as his hand went outside of the cave, anticipating to be burnt again. But Maxie was pleasantly surprised as he discovered his hand had not burned in the moonlight like in the sunlight before. Here we go. It's now or never, Maxie whispered to himself to help encourage his next courageous move. Maxie then took an extended breath and cautiously tippy-toed out of the shadows of the cave into the moonlight of the surface world. After Maxie had walked a few yards in the moonlight, he stood still for a moment, opened his eyes and looked down to ensure he was not about to explode. Yippee! Maxie hollered once his senior was alright. Maxie continued to shout in excitement as he did a victory dance of joy now that he had accomplished his first task in Homitop's absence. Darius looked over and smiled when he saw what Maxie achieved. And so it begins, Darius whispered to himself before he proceeded to walk in the direction of Maxie outside of the cave. Some of the vampires in the coven pleaded for Darius not to go as he walked in Max's direction. Don't go, one vampire said. Please stay inside where it's safe, yelled another. Silent, Gia hushed the coven vampires. Darius continued through the masses, then walked across the barrier into the moonlight surface world. I always believed you could do it, Darius exclaimed to Maxie with a pompous laughter of joy. Darius then turned and addressed the coven that remained inside the cave. Come, Darius requested as he signaled with his hand for the coven to come. The vampire hunters joined Darius's side first, followed by all members of the coven council. Yet all of the vampires in the rest of the coven remained at the barrier, afraid of the deaths that awaited. Do not be afraid. Come and join me in this new world we have yet to wander. Let us unlock its mysteries together, learning the unknowing together, Darius concluded. After a brief moment of silence had passed, the younger coven vampire, whose friend died in the sunlight earlier, felt prompted to go. The young vampire maneuvered his way through the coven crowd to the cave entrance. Once at the barrier point, the young vampire walked out of the cave shortly followed by another. That's it, said Darius. Once a few of the coven vampires hesitantly made their way out of the cave unharmed, the other vampires exited the cave too. What is your name, boy? Darius asked the young vampire. Nahim, responded the young vampire. Thank you, Nahim, Darius told the youngster. The coven cheered and danced in the moonlight now that they have arrived to the world above. After the night had started to come to an end, Maxie looked up at the horizon and noticed a gleam of light begin to appear. Maxie hurried over to Darius with a worried look. Thank you, my brother. You really came through for me, Darius expressed to Maxie. What's with the long face? Darius asked once they realized something had bothered Maxie. I'm afraid the light has returned, Maxie said as he pointed to the sunrise that approached. We should not let it touch our skin, Maxie declared. Understood, Darius said. Quickly, everyone back inside the cave, Darius roared. The light of the surface world is returning now, and we must stay out of it or suffer the same fate as we saw before, Darius ordered. The vampires in the coven quickly marched back inside the cave before the sunrise fell before them. Unfortunately, the prankster vampire was not as lucky as the others. He awoke while the others were inside the cave as the sun had raised. "Where did everyone go? Is it me, or does it feel hot tonight?" The prankster vampire yawned and the sunlight reached his back. "Oh no," the prankster vampire said while he watched himself blow up in the sunlight. From then on, the coven understood the sunrise and sunfall periods after Maxie later created a sundial at the entrance of the cave on the days and nights that followed. The vampire coven went on to set up their living quarters along the edges and the cave top interior of the cave entrance. Unbeknown to the coven vampires on the surface, Imhotep's darkened spirit led the possessed dinosaurs deep into the underground. Once Imhotep believed he had reached the depths no vampire had gone before, Imhotep summoned the dinosaurs to build him an evil temple. A fortress that Imhotep's darkened mind had shown him in the visions over and over again on their journey back underground. The dinosaurs pushed over rocks and set the foundation and then built up from there as Imhotep commanded. When the structure was completed, Imhotep etched various dark spells inscription on the surrounding walls of the temple. After Imhotep etched in the last remaining inscription which read, "Death is the only beginning," he took a step away from the temple and raised his hands above his head in worship. "Death is the only beginning," Imhotep chanted as the dark spirit within him told. Suddenly, an explosion of green smoke arose under the temple and the green light illuminated the entire structure. When the doors of the temple slowly crept open, a bright light appeared from within. "It has begun," Imhotep said in a dark, ominous tone. Imhotep proceeded to lead the dinosaurs into the temple. Once the last possessed dinosaur had entered the temple door slammed shut and the light from the temple was extinguished. Meanwhile, on the surface, Darius and the coven vampires trekked through the lands and realized that the surface had even more dinosaurs than they had ever seen underground. The vampire coven lost themselves to the bloodthirst. Within a matter of months, the coven had feasted on nearly all the surface dinosaurs in the underground cave entrance area. Once the dinosaurs in the region had become extinct, the coven council was forced to convene to decide what to do next. "Were the hunters able to find anything on the hunt?" Darius asked. "We searched near and far, but it's just like the nights before. All that is left of the dinosaurs is bones," Kimbo said. "Then we have no choice to make. Either we move to another land where there's more food or return back to the underground," Darius continued. "We have come too far to return now. We must find another home," Gia stood up and said. Many of the other vampires in the coven shook their heads in agreement. "Then it is agreed. We shall find a better home on the surface," Darius exclaimed. "But we must figure out a better way to feed, so that we can make our food last longer than what we have," Darius added. The coven sat in deep thought. As Gia scanned the room, she noticed two children playing with some dinosaur bones on the floor, and she immediately flashed back to seeing Darius and Maxie as little ones making their pet dinosaurs fight against each other. "Ready?" Darius told Maxie with the baby dinosaur in hand. "Ready," Maxie replied. "Okay, fight," Darius commanded the baby dinosaur with his mutant trance power, and the baby dinosaur wrestled. "We could keep the dinosaurs alive as pets, like you and Maxie did when you were children," Gia added. "And instead of draining the dinosaurs' blood, we can feed on them to a limit that will not kill them," Gia continued. "Stop mid-feed?" Kimbo asked himself while he rubbed his belly. "Yes. This way we can keep the dinosaurs contained, breed them, and never run out of food," Gia concluded. "Brilliant, Mother!" Darius exclaimed. "It is final. The vampire hunters and I will search for new land with food, and from there, we shall keep the dinosaur we capture as livestock to breed, Darius concluded. Darius called the remainder of his band of vampire hunters to join him on a distant journey for a new home in territories unknown. As Darius and the vampire hunters packed their final belongings for their journey, Gia approached her adopted son Darius. "You should stay and allow the hunters to go, my son," Gia pleaded. Darius turned to Gia. "You have to understand, I must go," Darius explained. "There's no telling what they may face in these foreign lands. And I'll be needed now more than ever," Darius continued. "But what will we do without you here? The food has run out, and the coven will grow anxious as their hunger grows. We need you here," Gia stated with a worried tone. "You're right again. I will put things in order before I go," Darius replied. Darius then made his way to his coven. That was where to bid him farewell. "Coven," Darius announced. "In my stay, I leave my council of Maxi and Gia in charge of the coven. Treat them with the same respect you would me," Darius proclaimed. "These times will be tough. Food will need to be rationed and saved from this time on. Gia will let you know on the details. If I am to return and hear any issues have happened with any of you, I will personally handle you in the ways of the old laws without hesitation," Darius concluded before he walked away. The entire coven shook their heads in agreement to the decision of Darius. "Be safe," Gia told Darius while she gave him a hug goodbye. "I will do my best, mother," replied Darius. "Oh, I almost forgot. I got this for you for your journey," Gia told Darius before she handed him a small piece of gold. "What is this?" Darius asked. "I found it once on a hunt before the days of the coven. It has kept me safe until now, and I hope it will do the same for you, my son," Gia replied. Darius accepted the gift, then walked into the darkness of the wilderness with the vampire hunters. Chapter 4. We are not alone. After Darius and the vampire hunters passed the wilderness that surround the underground cave entrance, they approached the rocky mountain frontier. At the base of the great mountain, Darius looked up at the mountain. If only Marius could see this now, Darius thought to himself. "It's like nothing I've ever seen before," Tella said. "Get used to that feeling," Darius made a remark. "That is what I am worried about," Tella said under his breath. "What's that?" Darius asked. "Nothing," Tella responded, remembering who was Alpha now. Darius and the vampire hunters climbed the mountain using their claws. And about midway up the mountain, the sun began to rise over the horizon. "Look!" yelled Tella. Darius searched and searched for a possible place to hide as the sunlight quickly imposed. "There!" yelled Darius as he pointed to a small cave a short distance above. Darius and the vampire hunters quickly crawled their way across the rocky mountainside to the small cave. "Is everyone here?" Darius asked. Kimbo looked through the group in the cave. "All here, Alpha," Kimbo replied. "That was close," Darius said. "We need to keep track of the schedule that light comes and goes so that we can be better prepared next time," Darius stated as he searched among his subjects for a worthy hunter. Darius saw Tella was the first to make himself comfortable to rest. "Tella, you stay awake and keep up with how long the light lives. The rest of you rest. We shall climb over whatever they call this thing once the light is gone. And get some rest. You'll need it," Darius commanded. While Darius and the other hunters rested, Tella stood guard during the entire day. The day grew weary as Tella paced back and forth, bored and hungry. He suddenly heard the sound of a critter run into the bayous of the cave. "You can run, but you can't hide," Tella said with his fangs extended. Tella chased the small creature down deeper into the cave and feasted on its blood as he walked back from where he came. On the way back, Tella nearly tripped over a utensil on the floor. When Tella picked the tool up, he examined it. "What is this?" Tella asked himself. The object appeared to be carved by someone or something, possibly even a vampire. Tella rushed back to Darius and the hunters with his new discovery. As the sun began to set, Darius and the hunters awoke from their rest when Tella arrived. "Hey, you got breakfast?" Kimbo said as he snatched the critter out of Tella's hand and drained the creature's blood briefly before throwing it to the side of the cave wall. Tella contested. "My apologies. You know how I get when I'm hungry," Kimbo said. "What is that?" Kimbo asked. Tella walked over to Darius, who scratched from a long day's rest. "Look at this, Alpha!" exclaimed Tella. Tella handed the tool he discovered over to Darius. "It almost looks like the toys our fathers would carve when we were little ones, does it not?" Darius said as he examined the tool for himself. "I fear we are not alone, Alpha," Tella said. "It appears not," Darius responded while holding up the tool in the air. Darius then proceeded to address the vampire hunters as they equipped their gear for the climb. "It looks like we may have a few run-ins from the point forward. Be on guard," Darius told his hunters. The vampire hunters all shook their heads in agreement as they made their way out of the cave behind Darius. When Darius and the vampire hunters reached the peak of the mountain, Darius turned for a moment and noticed the beauty of the terrain behind him. "Have your eyes ever seen?" Darius whispered as he turned and looked over the beautiful landscape. Once the vampire hunters had climbed the peak, they also turned and gazed in awe at the beauty of the view for a moment. "Praise Marius! This is beautiful!" Tella's strongest warrior's son said. "You are your mother's child," Tella said to his son after he slapped Pella upside his head. The other hunters got a good laugh out of the remark as they all continued down the other side of the mountain. Back at the cave where Darius and the vampire hunters had rested a days past, a group of unidentified whooping creatures discovered the creature Kimbo had thrown to the cave floor. The dark silhouette of the leader of the creatures walked on 2 feet, then all fours before he reached down and picked up the dead creature. The leader then raised his other hand and the whooping of the others ceased. When the leader examined the crater, he quickly noticed 2 unidentifiable vampire bites on the crater. The leader raised the crater in the air and let out an aggressive whooping sound, which was followed by the others as they stamped out of the cave together. Darius and the vampire hunters leaped down the remainder of the mountain fairly quickly, before they made their way across the rocky mountain terrains and entered a rainforest with trees higher than their eyes could see. As they journeyed through the rainforest, the hunters heard a shrug in the trees above. "What was that?" asked Kimbo. After a few leaves fell, Darius looked up with his heat sensory vision to see if there were any detections of warm-blooded life. No signs of life appeared. "Stay alert," Darius commanded the vampire hunters before he continued through the rainforest. As daybreak approached, the hunters heard another shrug in the trees above. "We are being tracked," Tella said. A series of falling leaves quickly approached Darius and the vampire hunters. "Prepare yourselves! Here they come!" Darius ordered. The vampire hunters did as they were told. "Whoop!" roared a voice from above, followed by a series of whoops coming from every direction of the vampire hunters. "The light will come soon! How can we fight and stay out of the light?" asked Pella. "Silent your whimpers, boy!" ordered Teller. "Focus on one thing at a time," Darius proclaimed. "Kill as many as you can once they attack, and try to stay out of the light the best you can," Darius commanded. Suddenly, the dark figures from above dropped like marbles from the treetops and immediately dug deep into the soil beneath Darius and the vampire hunters. Darius looked around in confusion as these unknown creatures bypassed the hunters into the soil. When the last of the unknown creatures landed on the soil top, she looked up to Darius and the vampire hunters on all fours, hissing. Teller raised his weapon to attack the creature, but Darius held back his strike. Once the unknown creature rose to her 2 feet, Darius saw a lovely vampire beauty that was completely camouflaged in mud and dirt. When her intoxicated eyes met Darius's, he lost his breath. "Alpha!" exclaimed Teller. "What?" Darius yelled back as he snapped out of it. The female vampire then signaled Darius to dig under the soil when she pointed to the light that approached and dug a few scoops from the soil. "I think she wants us to follow them into the ground," Darius said. The female vampire then quickly dug herself underground. "Are you sure that is a good idea? It might be a trap," Teller said. As the light from the sun approached nearer by the second, Darius pressed his hand into the moist soil of the forest. "Hurry and dig yourselves into the mud," ordered Darius. The vampire hunters did as they were told and submerged themselves under the soil. At nightfall, Darius and the vampire hunters dug themselves back to the surface when they awoke to the vibrations from the movements of the unknown to the surface. Once on the surface, the vampire hunters heard a whistle from above while they brushed soil off themselves. When the vampire hunters looked up, they found themselves surrounded by a clan of unknown vampires. "I told you it was a trap," Teller remarked to Darius with regret. Suddenly, one of the surface vampires jumped down to the ground on all fours, which caused the vampire hunters to quickly draw their weapons. The surface vampires above started to whoop even louder than before after they saw weapons drawn from above. "Hold your weapons!" Darius then ordered. The vampire hunters put their weapons away. The surface vampire leader rose up to his 2 feet, lifted his fist in the air, and then hollered. A series of whoops then silenced the surface vampire's whoops from above. The surface vampire leader then shrugged his head at Darius and smirked as to say, "I can control my people too." The surface vampire leader approached Darius on all fours as Darius stood firm at the lead position of the vampire hunters. Up close, Darius gazed upon the unfamiliar breed of vampire on the surface. Unlike the underground vampires, whose features took a more bat-like appearance, the surface vampires shared a more likeness feature with that of the prehistoric cavemen seen in apes. Additionally, Darius noticed that the lead surface vampire had 5 fingers and toes that differed from underground vampire 3-clawed hands and feet. "Where are their wings?" Kimbo asked Teller. "They look funny to me," Teller replied. Once the surface vampire neared Darius, he examined Darius as he circled around him. "I think he likes you," Kimbo remarked jokingly. The vampire hunters found amusement in the remark and laughed. The surface vampire leader then imitated the sound of the laughter as he heard when he laughed in a loud and obnoxious manner, thus silenced the vampire hunters. Darius made a proper introduction to break the ice. "I am Darius," said Darius as he pointed to himself. Darius pointed to the lead surface vampire and asked, "Who are you?" One of the surface vampires that watched from above assumed that Darius's sharp-pointed finger was a sign of aggression towards the leader. The surface vampire whooped immediately leaped down to protect his leader. "Battle formations!" Teller ordered. Kimbo and the other vampire hunters quickly got into their fight stances, prepared for an attack. "Wait!" Darius commanded. "Hold your positions. They have yet to attack us. "We will not attack them," Darius exclaimed. The vampire hunters lowered their guards as the aggressive surface vampire approached Darius. After seeing this sign of peace, the female surface vampire that helped Darius and the hunters dig themselves under the sunlight earlier decided to intervene. She leaped down to the ground and landed directly between Darius and the aggressive surface vampire. "Hello, again," Darius said as he looked up and down her sexy figure when she landed. The female surface vampire brushed off Darius's welcome and turned to face the aggressive surface vampire. Darius then checked his own breath to see if he smelled bad. The female surface vampire gently placed her hand on the surface vampire's chest and whispered something in his ear. While it is unknown what was said, it appeared to have little to no impact on the aggressive surface vampire, who moved the female surface vampire to the side afterwards. The lead surface vampire immediately whooped, which caused the aggressive surface vampire to immediately stop and look over at his leader. The lead surface vampire then brushed his hand to tell the aggressive surface vampire to go away. The aggressive surface vampire took a long, frustrated breath and backed away from Darius. After the smoke had cleared, the female surface vampire walked over to her leader. There, she performed a series of hand-signing gestures of which Darius could not decipher. The surface vampire leader shook his head in agreement. The surface vampire leader then whooped to his people in the trees and walked into the darkness of the rainforest, followed by a series of falling leaves from above. The female surface vampire approached Darius once the others had gone. The female surface vampire grabbed Darius by his forearm and guided him to the same direction as the surface vampires. While Darius walked with the female surface vampire arm in arm, Darius thought a different way to quote her. "I know she doesn't understand my words," Darius thought. "I just wanted to say thank you for helping us back there when the light came," Darius said. The female surface vampire smiled at Darius and continued to guide him through the rainforest. "You know, I think you're one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen," Darius proclaimed when he was close enough that the vampires could not hear him. The female surface vampire smiled at Darius again and continued to guide him through the rainforest. Darius then stopped momentarily and asked, "What is your name?" The female surface vampire grunted and tugged Darius by his arm. "I must know your name. I am Darius. Who are you?" Darius demanded. The female surface vampire looked away in the direction they must go and then back at Darius. "Sierra," Sierra said after a long exhausted breath. "Sierra, it's nice to finally meet you," Darius responded. Darius extended his arm to continue their walk through the rainforest together. Sierra forcefully took Darius's arm and continued to guide him through the rainforest. "You see, that wasn't so hard," Darius jokingly said with a smile. The female surface vampire ignored Darius and continued to guide him forward. "Do you think our offer has found his match?" Kimbo said to Tella as they watched Darius and Sierra bicker. "They are so ugly. No wings or claws. There is no fun in that," Tella proclaimed. After the group had walked for a while, Sierra and Darius came to a giant tree. Sierra guided Darius to a hidden entrance that served as a passageway inside of the tree. When Darius and the vampire hunters entered the tree, they were escorted through a series of traps made from the leaves. Once Darius reached the core of the tree, he looked up and he was astounded by the architecture of the surface vampire homes lined up on upward trail embarked in the interior of the tree. It was like they had entered another world. Sierra grunted and pulled Darius by the arm as she was ready to keep moving. "I like what you did with the place," Darius said as they proceeded up the trail that ran across the tree's interior. While Darius walked up the trail, he placed his arm across the wooden interior and admired the craftsmanship of each home. In a way, it looked like each home had its own identity that was told through carved picture stories. This artistic craftsmanship was unlike anything ever seen underground. After a few whoops from the surface vampires arose, some of the surface vampires exited their homes and stared at Darius and the vampire hunters as they passed. Sierra continued to walk her guest up the tree bark. When they reached what appeared to be the top of the stairwell, Darius entered the house of a surface vampire leader behind Sierra. The surface vampire leader was inside playing a dice game on the floor with his newborn son. Once the surface vampire leader realized Darius's presence, he sat up and clapped his hands. The aggressive surface vampire suddenly entered with a half-dozen surface vampire soldiers. The surface vampire leader's mate entered thereafter and took their baby out of the room. The surface vampire leader motioned for Darius and the vampire hunters to sit beside him with his hand. Darius and the vampire hunters sat as they were instructed. Once seated, the surface vampire leader clapped his hands twice, and suddenly, Sierra entered the room with 3 attractive female surface vampires behind him. Each carried several injured live animals on plates. Darius was surprised. Sierra looked even better cleaned up than she did with dirt all over herself. For in the underground, dirt was a common aphrodisiac for the underground vampires. Darius admired Sierra's skin as she approached. Offside, it appeared so much smoother than that of his opposite sex in the underground. Sierra came down to her knees and presented the animal sacrifice to Darius. Darius smiled and accepted his animal sacrifice offering plate from Sierra. But before he could take a bite into the sacrifice, Kimbo stopped him by holding Darius's arm. "Wait!" Kimbo declared. Darius hesitated before taking a bite into the sacrifice. "Please, allow me to try it first," Kimbo requested. Darius nodded in agreement and proceeded to present the sacrifice to Kimbo. Kimbo took the sacrifice and examined it on both sides. Kimbo then opened the animal's mouth and sniffed its breath. The surface vampire leader pounded his fist on the ground as he grew impatient that no one had eaten the food he offered. "Now or never," Kimbo declared before taking the sacrifice and tasting its blood. Darius and the others watched Kimbo's reactions to the blood he drank. "Eat! The blood is good," Kimbo then said. Darius and the other hunters grabbed their sacrifices and prepared to eat. That is, until Kimbo started to cough profusely and moaned as though he was poisoned. "Just as I thought!" exclaimed Teller. Darius and the vampire hunters raised their feet and reached for their weapon. Kimbo fell to the floor and started to laugh. Some of the other vampire hunters saw amusement in Kimbo's prank. Not Teller. "Be careful of the foolish games you play. One day your tricks could lead to your doom," Teller told Kimbo with a stern look. "Why so serious all the time, Teller?" Kimbo remarked. "Someone has to be with you, fools," Teller responded before he grabbed his sacrifice and ate it with a few other older vampire hunters. Kimbo approached Darius, who was also not amused by Kimbo's prank. "I pray to our ancestors it doesn't kill you," Darius told Kimbo after he watched Kimbo's ordeal with Teller. "The blood here tastes a little different from back home, but I assure you it is clean," Kimbo said to Darius as he caught his breath from all the laughter. "You know, Teller is right. Now is not the time for games, Kimbo. Just think, if we would have attacked someone or one of their guards attacked one of ours. Marius would always tell me, think before you act. You should try it sometimes," Darius said to his longtime friend. Kimbo's joyous smile turned serious. "I apologize, my alpha. I will do better and prove myself from now on. This I promise," Kimbo replied. "I hope so, because we are all we have out here, and I need you, brother," Darius stated. "Understood," Kimbo said. "Now, let's eat. I'm hungry," Darius exclaimed with an upbeat change of the subject. Darius and the vampire hunters enjoyed themselves as they feasted with the surface vampires. During the occasion, Darius's eyes were glued to Sierra when she re-entered the room. Kimbo let out a loud bashful and looked over to Darius, who was seated beside him, completely focused on Sierra. "You know, I heard if you look too long, your eyes will end up staring like that," Kimbo remarked to Darius. Darius suddenly broke his concentration on Sierra when he heard the remark. "What are you talking about?" Darius replied. You know exactly who I'm talking about," Kimbo said with a huge smile on his face. After a brief and odd moment of silence had passed, Kimbo looked back at Darius, staring again. "Just go talk to her already," Kimbo exclaimed as he picked Darius up from the floor. "She won't understand a single word I say," Darius said as he was on his feet. "There is more than one way to tell someone when you want to get to know them," Kimbo replied as he gently pushed Darius in the direction of his conquest. After Darius regained his footing, he walked over to Sierra while she prepared another sacrifice for the surface vampire leader at the sacrificial table. "I know you don't understand my words, but I would like to teach you," Darius said to Sierra as she broke the legs of an infant dinosaur sacrifice. Sierra turned toward Darius, then shook her head in agreement despite not knowing what Darius had requested. Darius pointed to himself before he pointed his finger at Sierra, then used his hands-to-mouth communication between the two. At that moment, Sierra had a moment of clarity once she understood Darius wanted to teach her his language. Female surface vampires typically were not subject to learn new things on the surface world. So, Sierra was thrilled. She could finally prove to her people that female surface vampires were equal, if not superior to their male counterparts. Sierra then pointed to herself before she pointed her finger at Darius, then used her hands to mouth communication. "Yes, I would be honored to learn your language as well." Darius and Sierra found a corner in the room and taught one another their respective languages while seated. The two chatted for the remainder of night and far into the next day, while the others were passed out on the floor. Darius extended his sharp fingernail and wrote his name on the side of the tree bark. Darius. Darius, he said as he inscribbled the letters of his name on the bark. Darius pointed to his inscription and pointed to himself. "Darius," he repeated. Sierra traced the inscription Darius made with a finger. "Darius," said Sierra. "Yes, I am Darius. And you are?" Darius replied. Darius wrote Sierra's name on the side of the tree bark next to his. C-I-A-R-A. Sierra, Darius said as he inscribed the letters of Sierra's name on the bark. "I am Sierra," Sierra then said. Darius lit up with joy when Sierra spoke in his native language. Darius reached for Sierra's hand to show her how to write what she had just said. However, Sierra quickly flinched her hand away as a defense mechanism, grabbed a nearby tool and pressed it against Darius's neck. "So you don't like being touched. I get it now," Darius said as he backed away slowly with his fingers raised. Sierra put down the sharp tool she had. Darius sat back on the floor and patted the ground beside him. "Will you sit with me?" "I won't try anything," Darius promised. Sierra looked at Darius with cautious eyes as she sat. Once Sierra seated, Darius breathed a sigh of relief. Darius tore off a nearby piece of a bark from the side of the tree and inscribed Sierra's name on it. C-I-A-R-A. Sierra, Darius said. Darius placed a piece of a bark on the ground for Sierra to try. Sierra was amused by Darius's enthusiasm and smirked at him. Darius and the vampire hunters said their goodbyes to the surface vampires they encountered at the giant tree entrance. Darius bid farewell to the leader of the surface vampire in the surface vampire's native language, which pleasantly surprised the surface vampire's leader. Ciara smirked as Darius showed off the language that she had taught him. Darius then proceeded to join the vampire hunters that made their final preparations for their journey. Ciara approached Darius from behind, and Kimbo grunted to make Ciara's presence known to Darius. "Thank you," Ciara said in the underground vampire's language. Kimbo and the other vampire hunters were shocked to hear their language come out of Ciara's mouth. "No, it is I who should thank you," Darius replied. Darius offered Ciara an ornament gift he had carved to remember him. Ciara accepted the ornament, nodded her head to Darius, and returned back to the surface vampire leader's side. Darius was briefly mesmerized by Ciara's posture as her hips naturally twisted and her butt swayed. Darius sounded to himself before he snapped out of it and turned back to his vampire hunter brothers. "Move out," Darius declared. The vampire hunters followed Darius as he led them deep into the rainforest. Darius and the vampire hunters wandered through the rainforest jungles thereafter. During the night, they would explore new terrains, and during the days, they used the digging techniques taught to them by surface vampires. After several nights, Darius and the vampire hunters came upon a vast desert of sand that extended further than their eyes could see. "Are we there yet?" Kimbo asked as the vampire hunters continued their march through the sands. Darius and the vampire hunters approached a vast water trail that extended through the desert. It was here that Darius finally discovered numerous dinosaurs congregated to drink water. "This is it!" Darius exclaimed. "This shall serve as our new home," Darius continued. "Thank Marius," Kimbo declared as he dropped to the sands for a seat. The other vampire hunters cheered and celebrated their journey had reached its final destination. Suddenly, the celebration was cut short by a loud and monstrous roar heard from the clouds above. Many of the dinosaurs scattered once they were alerted by the familiar roar. Darius and the vampire hunters got in their defensive positions and looked up in the direction of the source of the sound. Then Darius heard the approach of the beast that sounded like a jet plane cutting through the air. "Dig, you fool!" Darius ordered. Darius and the vampire hunters quickly submerged themselves under the sand. Seconds later, Darius and the vampire hunters felt a giant thud when the beast above had landed on the sands. Darius and the vampire hunters could hear the beast as it roared and chased down the dinosaurs they had seen congregated on the water away. After the unknown beast had devoured a few of the dinosaurs above, instead of flying away, the beast paced back and forth on the sands above. From below, Darius and the vampire hunters could hear what they believed to be the beast sniffing the air as though an unfamiliar scent had entered its nostrils. The beast then tilted its head towards the area Darius and the vampire hunters were hidden. The beast sniffed one final extended sniff before it let out another roar and flew away in the direction that Darius had come. Once the beast had flown away, Darius and the vampire hunters re-emerged from the sands. "Are you sure this is the best place for us?" Kimbo asked as he picked himself up out of the sand. Darius ignored the remark. "We must return to the caves with haste," Darius proclaimed. "I fear we have put our people in danger," Darius concluded as he watched the winged beast fly back into the direction from whence they came.